Thank you, Nikhil. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining day 2 of the Shared Value Leadership Summit. I am absolutely thrilled to share a few thoughts today about how corporations are advancing equity, what are some lessons learned, and what is needed going forward. By way of introduction, I've been at FSG for the last 18 years and have served as CEO for the last 3.5 years. During that time, I have helped lead FSG on our own intentional, multi-year, and ongoing equity journey. I've also had the privilege of advising multiple Fortune 100 companies on their racial equity work over the last 3 to 4 years. One caveat, I don't consider myself an equity expert. That said, I've been in the arena doing this work internally and externally and learning from equity experts within FSG and from partners such as our friends at PolicyLink. Today, I'm going to focus on our work with US-based companies. That work primarily emphasizes racial equity. However, many of these lessons are relevant across geographies and different types of equity. In Bobby's opening remarks yesterday, she framed this critical moment that calls for the private sector to play an outsized role in delivering greater equity. She urged us to imagine and design a more inclusive system that delivers equitable access and opportunities. With that framing in mind, what are we learning from the work companies are doing to advance equity? I want to start by sharing 4 observations from our equity work inside companies. First, individual equity work is imperative. If we skip over this step, our companies will be ill-equipped to advance equitable strategies. Of course, we know people are at different points on their equity journeys. What's important is to increase an individual's awareness and capacity to understand and address inequities. In our work with clients, we conduct workshops where we ask folks to share when they have experienced advantages and when they have experienced disadvantages based on their respective identities. I can tell you it's a fascinating exercise. I've observed straight white men like myself really struggle to identify any moments of disadvantage in their lives, whereas women or people of color could fill an hour sharing stories of the disadvantages they have experienced. This tends to be a light bulb moment for who have often walked through life benefiting from the layers of privilege built into our systems and cultures. Second, senior leadership matters. It sounds trite, but if your CEO and executive team are not leading on equity, your company won't take it seriously and the culture will not evolve fast enough. This requires authenticity and vulnerability from our senior leaders. It requires listening and learning. It requires creating more diverse and inclusive decision-making structures. I've worked with companies where the CEO was deeply committed and participating in equity work, in the room, advancing the agenda. That was so powerful and inspiring. But I've also worked with companies where the CEO and executive team were absent from the equity conversations, not participating, not doing the work, not advancing their learning with the internal champions. Their absence was called out by participants. Internally, this dynamic can be experienced as a form of equity washing. And we know that this internal perception will eventually become the external perception as well. Third, reckoning with past harms. Over the years, companies have contributed to inequitable outcomes in their communities, intentionally or not. In our work with clients, we've seen longtime employees of companies learn, often for the first time, how their company's business decisions have harmed historically marginalized communities. Back in 2019, FSG released a report called Reckoning, Repair, and Change, which provided guidance to companies seeking to advance their racial equity work. A critical step in earning the trust of stakeholders is understanding and acknowledging the history of a company's role in creating and sustaining inequities. When we think about advancing health equity, the primary topic of today's sessions, we can learn from the examples of how the healthcare industry has been reckoning with past harms. The pharmaceutical industry, for example, is reckoning with past exclusionary approaches to clinical R&D. Marginalized populations who could benefit most from new products have often been systematically excluded from the clinical R&D process. The behavioral health field is reckoning with the role of the field of psychiatry which has supported racist ideas and contributed to behavioral health inequities. For example, recent studies point to the continued overdiagnosis of schizophrenia and underdiagnosis of mood disorders in the Black community. And in our hospitals and health systems, providers are less likely to deliver effective treatment to people of color when compared to their white counterparts. This includes physician bias, underestimating pain that Black people feel, and Black patients receiving older, cheaper, or more conservative treatments. I know that these reckoning conversations are super challenging to have within a company, excruciating, really. And it's even more difficult to make these acknowledgements public, particularly for most companies that are fiercely managing their brands and reputations. At the same time, it's critical that companies be honest about their past contributions to inequities as a starting point for creating a more equitable future. Fourth, core versus periphery. Many companies are focusing their equity efforts in their philanthropic and CSR activities. That's important, but change at scale will not happen unless this transformation is core to a company's mission, vision, and strategy. FSG and PolicyLink recently published a paper titled Healthcare and the Competitive Advantage of Racial Equity. The paper examines how leading healthcare companies are redesigning the ways they provide core products and services to better meet the needs of people of color and to simultaneously achieve business value. I'll walk through just a couple of examples. Promedica, a large integrated healthcare delivery system, added a new step in service delivery by screening patients for 10 social determinants of health indicators, such as food insecurity and transportation challenges. Asking the patients what they need rather than relying on assumptions about them can reduce biases and in turn leads to improved health outcomes and reduced costs. Cigna, a global health insurance company, uses data science to identify and track disparities among customers. Cigna created a disparities dashboard to track several quality measures by race and by gender, which informs the development of targeted clinical interventions, such as a colon cancer screening campaign culturally tailored for Latino and Black men. As folks on this call know, building these strategies into the core business is the essence of a shared value approach to advancing health equity at scale. Given those lessons and what we're observing in companies more broadly, what's needed going forward? We all know companies are making bold equity commitments, and we know they are struggling to put those commitments into action. I want to highlight two key missing elements to advancing equity. First, a common roadmap to follow. Companies have said, we need guidance. We need best practices. What does good look like? And second, accountability for change. Companies want to know how to measure progress in a standardized way. I'm excited to share that FSG is partnering with PolicyLink and Just Capital to address both of these elements. We have formed the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance to turbocharge the advancement of racial equity within corporations. For a roadmap, we have developed the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, which defines what it means to be an anti-racist, equitable company. It looks at this in 3 dimensions: inside the company, in the community, and in society. For accountability, we are in the process of developing common standards that companies can report on and be measured against. These standards will be piloted in 2022, working closely with existing standards bodies. This will provide transparency on equity performance for executives, employees, investors, and other stakeholders. This is such a critical, pivotal time for the private sector to help advance equity. I am deeply energized by companies' aspirations, by the progress I'm seeing, and by the possibilities that lie ahead. Nobody has figured this all out, but together we can begin to glean knowledge of what's working so we can all contribute to a more equitable future. Thank you all for your participation and engagement this week, and I will pass it back to Nikhil.